Nick Surgey is a researcher and journalist. He is the executive director of Documented, an investigative watchdog group that reports on powerful political actors on the right in U.S. politics. And they certainly give Nick and his team lots to report on these days. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and you are on mute. But we do invite you to ask questions by putting them in the Q&A box. Make sure you put them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. In the last half hour, Nick, Diane, and Jessica will answer as many questions as time allows. One last thing before we begin. If you are interested in hearing more from Nick and his team, please register for our Network for Public Education 10th Anniversary Conference next month in Washington, D.C. You can find more information on our website, networkforpubliceducation.org. Thank you, everyone. Diane, would you like to begin?
Thank you, Carol, and welcome to everyone who's joined this webinar. I'm very excited about it because I'm excited to get to know Nick Surgey. Nick is an investigative journalist, and he has worked in some of the most important media fora that investigate things that are happening behind the scenes, where corporations are very wealthy people are buying outcomes that are not democratic. And I'm particularly happy to see him reporting now on what's happening in education, because I have been thinking for quite a few years that there is, in fact, a conspiracy to destroy public education. And it's been very hard to flesh it out, but it seems to be coming into our vision these days as one red state after another endorses vouchers and makes them universal, so that even rich kids get public funding for their elite private education. Nick, I would like to begin by asking you some questions about what brought you from investigating all sorts of other things to investigating education.
Well, it was an accident, really. We did a project a couple of years ago on a group called the Council for National Policy, which some people on the call may have heard of, but many probably have not, and that's by design. They were an organization that was created in 1981, founded out of the religious right, and a number of groups that were from the new right. It was a sort of Tea Party movement of the day. And we had been doing a project on this a couple of years ago, and it ended with a number of big stories. We obtained internal recordings and documents and other materials. And it's really from doing that work that we started to look at a donor network called Ziklag, which is part of this story. They're the group that is funding this effort by Alliance Defending Freedom. And also at the same time, we were trying to look at who were the kind of most successful litigants before the Supreme Court. And it was very clear to us that Alliance Defending Freedom were kind of at the top of that list. And so we decided that we were going to do two projects, really. One that was looking at Ziklag, this funding network, and one that was looking at Alliance Defending Freedom. And honestly, it was not planned. The two kind of came together as they were working on this plan to really devastate the public education system. They're trying to, as they tell it, trying to take a third of the public schools budget away. And so, you know, we wanted to see what Alliance Defending Freedom was up to, because we knew that they were the group that took down Roe. You know, there's this hugely influential, powerful group with connections all across the country to other groups, other organizations. Justice Amy Coney Barrett worked for them for a number of summers, training law school students. So we wanted to see what else they were doing without really knowing that it was going to be this plan to attack the public education system, but that's where it ended up going.
And do you feel comfortable using the word plot or conspiracy? Because how widespread is this conspiracy or plot?
Well, as you know, and I've written about, I mean, they've been working on this for many years, there the specific tactics may have changed, but the objective seems the same, which is to weaken the public education system to the point of breaking. They now feel that they have an opportunity because of the makeup of the Supreme Court and this recognition, and they talk about this openly in some of these recordings, that politically it's very difficult for them to achieve their objectives now, because of the power of teachers. That's what they talk about. And they've been having obstacles constantly over the last several decades in that. But they think that they have an opportunity now because the court is so radical. And they have tried this. They've tried litigation over the years. They've been successful, piecemeal litigation. But now they think that they can be bolder and that they can achieve something that they couldn't really have dreamed of a couple of decades ago.
Well, you know, I have observed historically that there have always been some people who didn't believe that the public should pay for education at all. You can go back to the 19th century, and there were lawsuits saying, why are we paying for high school? These are privileged experiences that only a few kids will enjoy, and it should not be the taxpayer's burden. And those lawsuits lost, and our schools continue to develop high schools and to make high school education eventually universal or nearly universal. But you can go back over time, and this current choice movement, school choice, really starts in the 1950s with the Brown decision. And it's then that there are a number of states that pass laws for vouchers, and they specifically want white kids to escape schools where they might encounter Black children. And I know that the choice movement doesn't like to acknowledge that history, but that is the history. It strikes me also, you know, looking back to the founding of ALEC, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, was created in 1973. And they're very clever because their members are legislators, state legislators, and they have about 2,000 members. And ALEC is supported by major corporations. I was astonished to see the list of corporations, including some that we think of as very mainstream that all of us use, who are supporting this incredibly reactionary organization that wants to take down gun control, environmental regulation, almost anything you can think of. But as you have seen I've seen lots of organizations. We now can throw in Moms for Liberty and Parents Defending Freedom and so forth. But in addition to Alliance Defending Freedom, what would you say are some of the other major players in this ongoing conspiracy?
Well, Heritage, I would put in that frame now. You know, Heritage has evolved a little bit over the years, and it's, I would say, as radical as they've ever been. They got a new president who came from the Texas Public Policy Foundation and has definitely been kind of edging them back to where they were previously, which is kind of on the fringes, operating on the fringes, but having very strong connections to politicians, sort of more mainstream Republican politicians in DC. And many of those groups that you just named, Moms for Liberty, Moms for America, they work actually in formal coalition with Alliance Defending Freedom Heritage as well. There's a whole long list of them. And we can send that list around if people are interested in it. But yeah, and they're often, many of the leaders of those organizations are also leaders within the Council for National Policy. So Mike Farris, who was the Alliance Defending Freedom president during the time that we got these recordings, he actually stepped down in October. He was a leader within the Council for National Policy, where they first hatched this plan, talking with Bill Barr, the former Attorney General. And he's now been replaced by a lawyer called Kirsten Wagner. She's also now a leader within the Council for National Policy. And so are many of the other leaders of those other organizations that you mentioned and others. So, you know, they meet in secret many times a year. They're in these other formal coalitions. And I think what we hear in these recordings is a pretty frank assessment of what they're trying to do. They don't often speak as frankly as they do when they're speaking to their donors. and they're trying to get their money. And that's kind of what's revealed here. But as I say, you have documented this better than I. They've been working on this same plan for decades. In fact, if you go back to kind of some of the things that Mike Farris, again, he was the president of Alliance Defending Freedom at the time that these recordings were made. Some of the things that he was doing in the 1970s, he was the Washington State director for the Moral Majority, a religious right organization. And he was doing the exact same stuff with education, trying to ban books, sex ed, the same kind of things, but with a lot less success and a lot less, really a lot less options with the courts, because ultimately they would have expected that this wasn't going to get past the Supreme Court, but now they think that they're in with a shot.
Well, it seems that just in the past few years, there's been a convergence of the religious right, libertarians who are not necessarily religious, but who want to basically disable government. And all sorts of right-wing groups have come together that have a lot of dissimilarities, but the one thing they have in common is that they want to destroy public education as well as other public functions that we are normally expect our government to provide, like environmental regulation. And they've done an absolutely bang-up job of gutting gun control. So I assume that public schools are next on their list. I'm not sure if you saw it, but there was a Gallup poll that just came out recently showing that the overwhelming majority of parents who have children in public schools are very satisfied with their public schools. It's something like 75% are happy with their public schools. The public, however, thinks the public schools are failing. They have heard over the years now about groomers and teachers who are pedophiles and test scores and learning loss and all this constant negativity. And there are, I guess, different places you can trace it back to. But certainly these culture warriors like Chris Rufo have been banging the drums. And he said very explicitly in a speech at Hillsdale, which I hope you've seen, he said that the way to get to universal school choice is by cultivating universal distrust of public schools. And so we have this constant throwing mud at teachers at public schools and highlighting anything that's negative and twisting test scores to say, oh, look, half the kids are below the average. Well, guess what? The average is half, and half the kids will always be below average. But it's that sort of manipulation of data that leads to people to say the schools are failing, when in fact, public schools have been a very vital and important part of this country and creating a public that has a very vibrant culture, high levels of technology. I mean, when you say that the public schools are failing, it's sort of like saying America's failing. So on these folks on the right will say America's great and the public schools are failing, and that doesn't make sense.
But I think I would add to that they really despise the public education system. Mike Farris, who I keep talking about because he's probably the most prominent person who's talking in these recordings, where he's laying out, we have a number of recordings that we first provided to the Post, and in those recordings he really lays out this strategy, but he also talks about why they want to do this, he, as I said, he really despises the public education system. Farris has said that the public schools are a godless monstrosity. He compared the public school system to the Third Reich. Ziglag, who's the donor group that was funding this Alliance Defending Freedom effort, they talked about teaching in public schools as being satanic. And this is when they're talking to each other. This isn't because they're on social media and they're trying to whip people up to go and protest at school board meetings or something. This is where they're in a closed conversation where they're planning their strategy. You have to think that they really believe this. They really just despise the public education system.
So Nick, you've referred to this recording that you had access to. Can you talk about how you gained access to it, or is that off the record?
Yeah, I can't talk about how we gained them, but yeah, there are four recordings over a period of time from summer of 2021 through to the summer of 2022, conversations between Alliance Defending Freedom's president, Mike Farris, and this donor network, Ziklag, both phone briefings, Zoom recording, and then recordings that were made at their conferences where their donors come and they meet with the groups that they're funding. Because what Ziklag does as an organization is you have to be very wealthy to and nominated to participate. You have to be able to show you have at least $25 million. And the point of this project is to raise money and work in close partnership with organizations in order to try and advance the mission of Ziklag. They have people that are part of Ziklag, including somebody called Lance Wallnau, who is probably one of the most famous Christian nationalists, self-described Christian nationalists in the United States, calls himself a prophet for the movement. They organize around this idea of seven mountain dominionism, which is something that's kind of a hot topic in Christian nationalism. And it means that they think that they have to conquer seven mountains, they call them, of our culture: government, entertainment, the church, the family, and education. And they really feel like they have to it's their moral duty, it's a sort of Christian duty from their perspective, to transform the public education system. So they really feel like this is a kind of religious moral duty for them to essentially transform, dismantle the public education system.
Well, it seems that when we're talking about the organizations that are part of this plot to destroy public education, one that we haven't mentioned, which is not normally listed among right-wing extremist groups, and which is really, I guess, a sign of the victory of this, or the success of this right-wing movement, that's the Republican Party. Starting back in the beginning of this millennium, the party line has been pro-choice, pro-charter, pro-voucher, pro anything that is privately managed, and opposed to government, because anything that's government is bad and anything that's private is good. And the Republican Party today is fully on board with this antagonism towards government. And as I read about the planning for a potential Trump second term, all of the plans involve dismantling government, dismantling the Environmental Protection Agency, dismantling the Internal Revenue Service, dismantling the FBI. And of course, among the department agencies that would go was the Department of Education. I've never cared one way or the other about the Department of Education, whether it's there or it's not there, but I do care passionately about public schools. And these are vital community institutions. And yet this coalition, which now includes the red states, is busily engaged in not in just promoting choice, which is fine, but promoting choice at public expense. And the money for education will not be increased. So the money that would otherwise go to public schools will go to religious schools, fly-by-night private schools, anyone who will take a voucher, or homeschooling, as you pointed out in the article in the Washington Post. So I think the other side of this picture that we haven't touched on is the huge advantage that this extremist movement has, which is almost unlimited funding. And we know, of course, the two big names, which would be Charles Koch, his brother David Koch having died not too long ago, and Betsy DeVos. And both of them are billionaires, but they're not the only ones. There are also billionaires. There are two of them, Wilkes and Dunn in Texas. There's a billionaire in St. Louis. There's a billionaire here, a billionaire there, billionaires in California. It's absolutely astonishing that so many billionaires are attracted to the idea of getting rid of what they call government schooling. Some of them themselves are products of public schools. The Walton family is extremely active in promoting charters, and I'm sure they'd love to promote vouchers too. And also, they're very, very anti-union. Sam Walton, who is the founding father of the Walmart chains, is a graduate of public high schools, but that doesn't seem to matter to them. They're doing whatever they can to advance the privatization of public schools. Have you, in your research, I tried in my last book to list all the billionaires that I could find, just looking at the donors to these right-wing organizations, and I would check them out very carefully. It's a long list of very wealthy people and major corporations. What interactions have you had that sheds light on the vital question, which is follow the money?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's obviously the literally $1 million question. It's very, very hard, and maybe in part for this particular project, and maybe in part that is why they're funding it in the way that they are. You know, it's ZICLAG, which again is the donor network that is funding this. They are they have a 501c3 and a 501c4. It's the 501c3, which is a nonprofit organization that is then making grants to Alliance Defending Freedom. We can follow in their tax filings that the money has been paid to Alliance Defending Freedom. We see that each year, them writing them very large checks. It's very, very hard to know who is funding this particular project because this is a story for another day, but some of those other organizations that you mentioned, including ALEC, are also have their own projects that ZICLAG is working with them closely on. And we can see that money flow through as well. What we don't know is who is funding ZICLAG, because it's by its nature, individuals who are giving that money, right? You've got to have 25 million in the bank. And then the idea is that you're funding these projects through this organization. Personal checks just don't appear in any tax filings. And so we kind of run into a brick wall there, and we're not really able to trace it any further. We do know that Betsy DeVos has given millions of dollars to Alliance Defending Freedom, or rather foundations, I should say, connected to Betsy DeVos, both the Prince family and the DeVos families. Was any of that money that has flowed, you know, for their work on education? You would think, based on her pattern of giving money for education projects, that it does, but you know, it's hard to say with any certainty.
I did see, Nick, in one of the comments, someone said that we shouldn't let Democrats off the hook in these issues, because while it's true that the big movement to dismantle public education is Republican driven, the Democratic Party became, I believe, subject to one of the greatest heists of our history, which is to be persuaded by Republicans that school choice was somehow in the interest of minority children and poor children. And so we used to hear for years that charters and vouchers would save poor children from failing public schools. But they don't say that anymore because it isn't true. It wasn't true then. It's not true now. And we now have evidence of the voucher research of the past 20 years, especially from Josh Cowan of Michigan State University. Josh worked on vouchers in Milwaukee and in other places, and he came to the study of vouchers with a lot of hopefulness about what they could accomplish. And he has since done a 180 and written article after article brilliantly about how the research of the past several years shows that when kids leave public school to go to voucher schools, they fall behind their peers in public schools. The dropout rate from voucher schools is very high, as much as 50%. Most of the kids who claim vouchers never attended a public school. Most of them are attending religious schools or private schools and now claiming vouchers because of these universal voucher programs, such as the one that was just passed in Florida and that have been passed in some other states. So basically 70 to 80% of the kids who get vouchers are not escaping failing schools. They're simply getting a subsidy from government to help their parents pay their tuition, even if the parents are rich and don't need that government help. And we know from charter research that there is yet to be a study that shows that charters outperform public schools. The Network for Public Education released a study of the latest Credo report and found that it did not show an advantage to charter schools. What we have been following closely through the Network for Public Education is charter school scandals. And we have a hashtag on Twitter, which I hesitate to call X, but on Twitter we have a hashtag called Another Day, Another Charter Scandal, because there is so much grifting and failure and lying about test scores and lying about money and stealing money. And it just goes, this is what happens when you don't have oversight and don't have accountability. Somehow I think that if the public understood that their public schools were the target of this vast right-wing conspiracy, it might wake up. Problem is, there's so much money on the other side. I was reminded that I should mention Democrats for Education Reform. That was and still is, a group of largely hedge fund managers and Wall Street people who have a very low opinion of public schools, a very low opinion of teachers, and who are avid supporters of charter schools and of evaluating teachers by test scores, which is a horrible failure. But it just shows the reach of this ideology into the Obama administration, which supported all of the bad ideas about expanding school choice and more testing and more punishment of teachers is somehow answers. And yet we have seen, ever since all of these so-called reform ideas have been implemented, we've seen the national scores have gone totally flat. So there needs to be a change in the conversation when you're talking about education, away from school choice, away from testing, away from closing schools, away from punishing teachers, towards constructive ideas and a vision about community schools that serve parents and communities and pay attention to things like medical care and also nutrition, basic stuff. And what's so alarming about the story that you tell and the digging that you're doing is that these people have no concern for the health, well-being, welfare of children. They're all about privatization. And privatization has nothing to show for it, other than that they are creating an interest group of people who are now getting vouchers who won't want to let go. And that's the way you build political power, is with money and with people getting the money who then have a vested interest in keeping the money flowing, even though it does not serve the public interest.
Dan, what you're saying about the facts, I think, is so powerful and powerful for the audience, that the facts, the truth about vouchers support what we are saying about how crucial public schools are. And as you just said, that vouchers don't have anything to say for them in their favor. And so I want to make sure we emphasize that what the research says, and that the research is out there increasingly more and more so to show these harms, especially over the last several years. And I want to direct folks to the Public Funds Public Schools research page, which is one place that has a compendium of this research on the various harms. I think getting the word out about how the peer-reviewed, really valid research shows these harms is really, really important to amplifying this message about the harms of privatization and the importance of public schools, and really goes to answer some of the arguments that privatizers are trying to make in favor of vouchers. For example, that vouchers help low-income families. Well, they really don't, right? Because as you said, the data now shows that the vast majority of students in many places where vouchers are being universalized are already in private schools. That's what the facts show. The facts also show that in so many places, in so many instances, low-income families can't even access a voucher because it doesn't even come close to paying for tuition at many private schools, let alone the other types of services that you were just mentioning, medical services, food, transportation, special education services that are included for free in public schools schools. Another thing that they'll say is that vouchers help students with disabilities. We know now from all the data that that's not true. We know that legally students lose so many of their IDEA and other rights when they take a voucher, so many of those crucial legal protections for students with disabilities, and that again, they can't access vouchers because private schools won't serve them, or private schools won't admit them, or they don't have the rights and they end up going back to public schools. So that's what all this Josh Cowan's research and so many others are showing now, that vouchers don't increase educational outcomes. And in fact, in many instances, students suffer lower educational outcomes when they take a voucher. So all these facts are sort of giving the lie to what privatizers are saying about vouchers. And including public schools. I agree, that's such an important message to get out there. And the research also now showing that, including a report that we recently put out by researchers at Teachers College Columbia to show that voucher spending, once it starts, tends to increase. And this only undermines the limited resources that are available for our public schools. So to amplify those facts, getting out there the truth about all of this.
Thank you, Jessica. Very important, and I'm glad that someone put a link up to your public schools, public funds page, because, you know, when people talk about choice, they say everyone deserves to have a choice, but they're really not so interested in choice as they are in getting public money for choice. I mean, people can make whatever choice they want to. They can send their kids to religious school if they want to. The fundamental issue is who pays for it. And that's what the red states are going so hard in the direction of universal vouchers, so that it doesn't matter what your income is. If you want to go somewhere else, if you want to have homeschooling, that's where the money will go. And it's all about the money. You can't ever take your eye off the prize. So Nick, what do you see as the next steps in terms of your own work?
Well, we're continuing to do research on Alliance Defending Freedom and this project. There's going to be more reporting that's coming out from another reporter and another outlet, and we provided some material to that. I can't really say much more about that because it's not us doing the reporting, but we provided a number of materials, and that will be out in the next couple of weeks. We have a video that we're producing that includes a lot of these clips, because really I think you do have to hear them saying a lot of the things that I've told you, a few of the things that they've said, but really you have to hear it in their own words, because these groups really are about as radical as you can get. There was a proposal that was a kind of white paper that was sent from the Council for National Policy to Betsy DeVos when she took over as Education Secretary, so in early 2017. Actually, the same reporter, Emma Brown at the Washington Post, that just did this story last week, also did a story on this in 2017, where they were outlining what they think the Betsy DeVos Education Department should do in the Trump administration. And that included eradicating the Education Department, but also cutting off all federal funding for education, pushing for school vouchers, really turning schools into a kind of place where they're only taught about the sort of biblical ideas to do with sex education and everything else. And so I think, yeah, you really do have to kind of hear them in their own words saying this stuff. That was a white paper, but we have a lot of recordings where they're really talking about this. So we have a video that's going to come out after that next story is published. And so there's more to come on this. And then when we come to the conference at the end of October, we'll be able to play all of these clips so people will be able to hear them.
You know, it's I think important in this discussion to recognize why we have public schools and why privatizing public education is a terrible idea. And that is that we are a very diverse society, and public schools are one of the few institutions that accept everybody. What we know from voucher research in other countries, like in Sweden and in Chile, is that privatization leads to even greater inequities than already exist. It leads to more segregation than already exists. It leads to more racial segregation, more social segregation, more religious segregation. And so everybody then will be attending a school where they learn only what their own group believes. They will have very little to do with people from who are of a different religion, a different race, a different ethnicity. everyone gets siloed. And when you consider that so many of these private schools are evangelical schools, which are Bible-based, and where they deny the existence of scientific theories like evolution, and where they teach a version of history that no historian would recognize, you have to wonder, what's the end game here? What do these people, other than saying, I want my child to be educated exactly the way I was educated, what does it do for our country? I think it just means a dumbing down of American education and going in a direction that's really anti-science, anti-history, and harmful to the future of our nation, not only in terms of knowledge, but in terms of our ability to work together. I mean, this is a country that gets more and more diverse by the year, and the turn towards privatization of public funding is a turn against diversity. I mean, we see it happening in Florida, for example, where the Florida state government is banning books that offend anybody. One parent can get a book banned, where private schools do not accept kids in many instances who have disabilities, where they are free to discriminate against based on anything, kids being gay are discriminated against. The Supreme Court had a decision in the last year or two, the Macon decision, where they said that Maine had to support 2 evangelical schools that specifically discriminate against people not of their own religious sect. They don't accept gay parents or gay families, but they don't accept Jews or Catholics either. This is not the right direction for this country. The more diverse we are, the more we need to interact and learn about each other and learn to work together and learn. I just see it as a disaster that is spreading and is being spread by people who have a self-interest in getting the money.
And those are, I want to say, Diane, those are, very concerning decisions that have come down in several cases over the last few years. But another, a very important thing that the court said in the Carson case, and that Chief Justice Roberts also said in the majority opinion that he also wrote in the Espinoza case, which was a few years earlier, both of those cases are, as you said, standing for the proposition that if a state funds private education, they cannot exclude religious schools from that compendium of options that parents have. But both of those cases also said very clearly that states do not have an obligation to fund private education at all. And that is a very important firewall that the Supreme Court has put up against, there's, I know, talk from the Washington Post article of these conversations, a strategy to try to break down barriers to public funding so that it can go to private education more broadly than it already is. But the Supreme Court has said that states do not have a legal obligation to fund private education. And so that is a very important thing for people to know and for policymakers to know, and that they have that option. And of course, given all these harms that we've talked about, they should not be choosing to fund private education.
Jessica, if I may ask you, what do you see as the next big case coming along that's going to test the limits of public funding of religious schools?
I think it's hard to say. I would, I guess, leave that to those who may be planning those lawsuits. But what I can say is a couple of things to hopefully help give people watching hope that we can stem that tide. The first is that there are so many allies around the country working with Education Law Center and Public Funds, Public Schools, and with so many others who are standing up for public schools and who are standing up for those constitutional and legal firewalls that protect our public education funding. Both in the courts, they're standing up for it. In legislatures, they're standing up for these protections for public education funding and for strengthening of public schools. And they're standing up for these things, on their school boards all across the country. So there are just so many allies. And also that there are courts across the country who continue to uphold these protections for public education funding and to strike down privatization laws. There are courts around the country that, are rejecting attempts to break down barriers in state constitutions that say no public funding of private schools. And there are also courts that continue to strike down voucher laws. So for example, just pretty recently in Kentucky, the Kentucky Supreme Court struck down a large private school voucher program there that would have diverted a lot of public funds to private education, saying that it violated the Kentucky Constitution and barriers that it has against that. So lots of courts are continuing to do that.
Well, I think that what I see as a hopeful sign is that the people in Nebraska were able to gather enough signatures to have a referendum put on the ballot. I think it's important to remind people that no state referendum on vouchers has ever passed. They usually go down overwhelmingly. They've gone down twice in Michigan. They've gone down in California. The one went down in Florida, most recently in Arizona. And what's concerning is not that they go down. It's great that the public usually is 65% or more against vouchers, but that in Arizona, the legislature simply ignored the vote and went ahead and expanded the voucher program, even though 2/3 of the public said we don't want vouchers. So that's frustrating. And I say that, you know, the people of Nebraska and every other state where they're pushing through vouchers should get as many votes out as they can, and then get active and try to throw out the people who violate the public's will. I wish it were that simple. I know it's not.
But yes, those referenda have gone, have either gone in favor of public schools and against privatization, as you mentioned, or there are other attempts recently to get vouchers on the ballot that didn't even make it onto the ballot. So yes, as you say, whenever those things have been put to the voters, they reject them.
Okay. We have so many questions now. I think what I'd like to do is just start throwing out some of those questions to the panel. And then, of course, panelists continue to ask questions of Nick or each other as well. So a lot of the questions have to do with what can we do? What can we do as citizens to stop this? And the first one is, how can local advocates get outside of local political forces that work to erase the voices of public education? How can we share our stories and research with investigative journalists like Nick, who can help us connect the dots and educate the public? What do you think, Nick?
Well, I'd love to hear from people. So if people know of things that are happening that could relate to the research that we're doing, one of the things that came up in some of these recordings is that they are really trying to rely on getting information from the ground up so that they can try and manipulate that in their litigation, so that they can try and kind of point to examples. If people are aware of that kind of stuff happening at the state level, at the local level, public record requests going into the schools, whatever it might be, if it could help in our investigations, if you know that these groups are active, it's really, really helpful to hear from that, so that that can help guide our investigation. So please do reach out if you know things.
I think when I was taking a look on your website, you even have a tip line there, a place where people can put tips.
We have about a half dozen ways that people can make tips for us. There is, whatever platform people use, people want complete anonymity, then we have a secure drop system that's set up. So I think it's documented.net/tips, but I'll make sure that I put that in the chat.
That's true.
I would add that because we do have people from all over the country, that to the extent that you can talk to whoever is the local education reporter and try to introduce them to work, it's all over the NPE website, work that explains the effort to destroy public education, the article where Nick's work was so important in the Washington Post, and then to try to get them to take a look at what's happening in your community and to report about the efforts to destroy public education from the local point of view. I would also say that what's crucial, if you would consider this, is to run for the local school board. There are these groups out there like Moms for Liberty that are trying to intimidate candidates and take over school boards, but they represent a very small minority. And in the last election, quite a lot of them were defeated. So I think most parents And most citizens want to have a sane school board that's not out to destroy the schools. And so consider that as something that you could do that would make a big difference.
So another question that we have is, and I think we may have touched on this when we talked about the referenda, but there may be other ideas as well. What have been the most effective strategies to thwart the efforts to destroy and privatize public education?
I think there's so many. I'll just jump in. There's so many, and the referenda example is so great because it really illustrates that these efforts to protect and promote and preserve and improve our public schools are led by, as Dan was saying, local groups and state level groups and people on the school board and people going to their state legislature and testifying, and it's so powerful. So I would say getting involved locally in the school, in your school board, of course, yes. Also, I think testimony at state houses when there are harmful policies on the table, or on the other hand, when there are positive proposals on the table, like Diane mentioned, community school proposals and wraparound services for students, to go and testify or to send testimony and make your voice heard in that way. We have seen be so powerful. And, we are also, and so many others are, as I said, standing up in the courts. That's another very important way to both oppose privatization programs and stand up for students' rights, and sort of adjacent issues as well, like school funding. I just want to make sure to mention that because, looking historically, as we have at the bigger picture on this webinar, the efforts to undermine public schools, to starve them of resources, and then to try to create, in our opinion, justifications for things like privatization, harmful things. That's an old story. That's not a new story. That's been going on, unfortunately, for a long time, that many public schools have been underfunded, starved of resources. And so the pandemic and the recent push for vouchers has put sort of a new gloss on that, but working not just against privatization, but for adequate funding for our public schools and for anti-discrimination and adequate services for students with disabilities and others are all connected here and very important strategies.
I would like to suggest one more, and that is to become active in your local school district and push your local school district and school leaders to get involved in it. So many times it seems as though school boards and superintendents and principals and PTAs are intimidated, but if they don't stand up, if we don't as a community come together and start to push back, eventually it will become overwhelming. And it's frightening in states like Florida and in Arizona. And they all tell the tale now to me all the time is, we wish we had gotten involved sooner. We wish we had mobilized a little bit earlier. And I think that's another important part. And that is, as a citizen, involving your neighbors and other community members in the fight for public education and making the case why it's so important. Here's another question. How private school voucher programs have monetarily burdened state boards of education, and how these private schools are unaccountable in the use of vouchers. One of our listeners would like you to expand on that a little bit.
So go ahead, Carol, restate the question. I'm not sure I understand it.
Yeah. I think they wanted the word "are" in there. How are private school voucher programs? How have they monetarily burdened state boards of education? And also, how are these private schools unaccountable in the use of vouchers?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. I know that in Florida, where they recently adopted universal vouchers, there's a budget organization in the state, a nonpartisan budget organization, that said that if every child now in private school applied for the voucher to which they're entitled, which is, I think, around $8,000, it would cost the state $4 billion a year. So that's a giant sucking sound coming from public school funding, unless the governor just decides to increase the budget by that much, which is unlikely. And another thing that has happened in some states is that private schools have raised their tuition because of tuition being underwritten by the state. So that makes it even harder for low-income families to afford private school tuition, because there are not many private schools of quality that have a tuition of $8,000 a year. They're usually 10, 15, 20 and up. And so not many, this is really a payoff to middle income and upper income families who can afford to pay the cost of private tuition. But it has been, the other thing about the private schools getting public money is that they are free to discriminate. And there was a wonderful series in the Orlando Sentinel a couple of years ago called Schools Without Rules, in which their reporters reviewed the policies and websites of all of the voucher receiving schools and found that they openly discriminated against kids with disabilities, against kids who were gay, against kids that they simply didn't want, possibly because of their having low test scores. The voucher schools are not required to use the state test, or in Florida, any test. So there's no accountability whatever for the voucher schools. And it's ironic because Florida started off under Jeb Bush as accountability is the answer to everything. And so we have to have lots of testing of teachers, testing of students. And now giant amounts of money are going to voucher schools where there's no testing. So the public schools, remember, continue to be under the gun of the standardized test. And if you want to escape standardized testing, take your voucher and go to a private school where you'll never be tested. But you may also have a teacher who's not certified, or a teacher who didn't graduate college, or for that matter, I don't think they even need to be high school graduates. So Florida is descending into a swamp, an educational swamp of haves and have-nots. And I can't say that the haves are in voucher schools, because they have unqualified, many of them, unqualified principals, unqualified teachers, and the state's paying for it.
Nick, I'm wondering too, if you could talk a little bit. A big focus of the article was that they wanted to bring a case to the Supreme Court with an argument that public schools were somehow religious schools because of secular humanism, or, I'm wondering if you could expand on that, because that seemed to be the hook that they were using to try to get money from the millionaires, was it not?
Well, I don't know if it was just a hook, actually. Mike Farris has been making this argument for decades, really, that sort of secular humanism, progressive values in public schools, and now on these reportings they're talking about critical race theory and LGBTQ rights, teaching around those issues in schools. That's also in the mix, but he's essentially been making these same arguments since, I think, the 1970s. They essentially have a number of arguments that they plan to make, and I kind of defer to Jessica as to whether we should have seen this or not yet, because we've seen a number of these cases being filed, both in federal court and also some similar cases in state courts. It's tricky to track for reasons that I could go into if people are interested. But we haven't really seen a lot of these arguments being made yet, that under the Establishment Clause, that the sort of teaching progressive values kind of amounts to a religion, and therefore shouldn't be allowed, and the remedy should be that people should be able to get a voucher and take their money out of public schools. But yeah, they've really, I mean, Farris in particular has been making kind of similar arguments throughout his entire career. His entire career really has been this issue at a variety of different organizations. As I mentioned, he worked for the Moral Majority, which was Jerry Falwell Sr., I should say, his organization. Way back in the day, he also worked for Phyllis Schlafly briefly at one point. He worked for Concerned Women for America. He created an organization called the Convention of States, which most people think of, if they think of it at all, as an organization that's pushing a balanced budget amendment, but really it's much broader than that. They want to have a a convention in order to amend the US Constitution, but education's in there. It's definitely in there as part of their project. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the legal arguments may have evolved slightly. Certainly the justifications in terms of talking about critical race theory, that's new. Wasn't talking about that in the past. But the objective, at least for Faris, and by extension, really, the people that he was working for, has always been to try and attack the public education system.
Yeah, I should mention, because I don't think you did, Nick, that Michael Faris is the major homeschooling advocate in the country. And the article in the Washington Post said that he had single-handedly diverted billions of dollars to homeschoolers. And he has belonged to many other organizations, but his primary interest has been homeschooling.
Since 1983, yeah, he founded the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, which was, they thought of it as a kind of union for homeschoolers. And there wasn't as much homeschooling back then, but they really aided the growth of it. And then he founded Patrick Henry College, which is a college for students who are homeschooled. Yeah, so that, yeah, you're quite right. That really is the through line throughout his entire career.
The other thing I want to mention before we close is that the education issue is not a standalone issue. It's also linked to racism through the attacks on Black history and also on so-called critical race theory. It's also linked to anti-gay sentiment. It also gets linked to the same people who are fighting to suppress the vote. I mean, all of these right-wing issues get intertwined, and many of the same people and many of the same funders are involved. And, you know, when you talk about issues that didn't exist a few years ago, who knew that transgender was a big issue until about a year or two ago? Suddenly, the idea of drag queens being criminal is a whole big deal, and they're being criminalized in state after state. And does it have anything to do with schooling? No, but it's all part of the same nexus of issues. So since I don't mean to sound partisan, but since the Republican Party is not proposing to do anything but cut taxes for corporations and high wealth individuals, they have to have all these culture war issues to get their base excited that they're somehow going to restore American culture to when there were no transgender children, no gay children, when there were very few Blacks and we didn't have to listen to them because they were segregated and silent. They want to return to a mythical past where white supremacy was the rule. And it's alarming, and the public schools stand in their way. And I thank you very much for the work that you've done, Nick, and look forward to your continuing contribution to what we know about this nefarious movement to destroy public education.
There's another question. What steps would you like Congress or a congressional committee on education to take? Is there anything that we can do nationally to push back? Well,
I personally would like to see Congress stop funding charter schools. That the program now spends $440 million a year for new charter schools every year. And when it was created, there were no charter schools, or very few, maybe 100 in the whole country. Now there are thousands of charter schools. Federal funding is not needed. And as our NPE reports have shown, much of that money goes to schools that never opened or that closed within a few years. So that is a source of funding that is absolutely wasted and should go into something that actually helps children, like children's health and wealth and nutrition.
Jessica, are there been some pushback on the SOAR voucher program as well, and has that been successful? And if not, what do you think the issues have been?
Well, yes, I wanted to mention that, Carol, that the DC voucher program is something that is under the control of Congress, and like all voucher programs, we believe money should go back into the public schools, though that program has not been shown to be effective. And as we discussed, voucher programs have been shown to have so many harms, including for the children in DC. But efforts to expand, promote vouchers and vouchers, at least private school vouchers, if we limit to that, have not been very successful at the federal level. Where we are most watching these things is in state legislatures in the states. And so And a lot of that has to do with, you know, a lot of education being controlled by the states, and with the right to adequately funded public schools being found in state constitutions rather than the federal constitution. And then with a lot of this push for privatization policies and other harmful policies being, of course, in state legislatures, especially over the last few years, as we see political shifts in state legislatures and supermajorities in various states. And so that is, I think, the place where we are most concentrating our energies. Both our tracking, and you can look at the Public Funds Public Schools voucher bill tracker, which we can put again in the chat to watch in your state. We're tracking all voucher and related legislation in all 50 states, as well as Congress. But again, you'll see it's mostly in the states. And that's also where a lot of the litigation and a lot of the legislative advocacy is happening, is in the states.
I think I would, yeah, go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to jump in and say, I mean, Diane, you mentioned earlier this sort of nexus of groups that are working on these issues, and it's more than a nexus, it's a giant network, really. But in terms of state legislation, there are a number of groups that we particularly look at. And I should say, besides litigation, Alliance Defending Freedom actually does a lot of work writing bills. And, you know, they don't make that public most of the time. We know on a different issue, but that they wrote the bill in Mississippi that then got challenged in the courts and ended up going up to the Supreme Court in the Dobbs-Jackson Women's Health case. But they do that presumably on education. That's one of the sort of missing pieces for us here. But other groups in that nexus that we've done work on that I think are particularly important include ALEC. Alliance Defending Freedom is similarly involved in ALEC. And there's a network of state think tanks called the State Policy Network. All of these groups get money from the DeVosses and the Kochs, including a lot of money as well that comes through this big donor-advised fund where millionaires and other interests can pull money called Donors Trust, and it makes it very hard to track. The State Policy Network is this network of state think tanks in every single state, and they work very closely together, and they're really one of the leaders in this so-called school choice movement. You know, many of these groups have just seen their funding skyrocket, really since Trump came into office in 2017. Alliance Defending Freedom, their revenue has literally doubled in the last 5 years. Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk's group, which is very, very active on this issue, their revenue skyrocketed. Judicial Watch, a number of other organizations. The cynic in me thinks that that's part of the reason that they're doing it, but certainly it gives them more money to spend on these efforts.
I think that they're feeling as though they're seeing success. You know, one of the things that concern me very much is this emphasis on homeschooling. And I don't know that the press has been very helpful in this regard, because ever since COVID, they'll share anecdotal stories about someone who's homeschooling and make it appear as though it's a national wave. And we don't know yet whether the numbers of homeschoolers have really increased. We won't know it until the federal government puts out its numbers, which unfortunately it doesn't do regularly on homeschooling. But there's a level there that is so deeply concerning. And I know, Diane, the other day you were talking a little bit about a case that recently was in the news with a homeschooling mom. And I was wondering if you would talk about that.
Yeah, I actually posted something on my blog about this. It's a woman who was a YouTube influencer. I think she had a couple of million viewers of her show, which was about how to be a very good parent by being very, very strict. And part of her formula was that when children disobeyed, they should be denied food and water. So she was recently arrested along with her partner in her business because one of her children, I think she has several children, 7 or 8 or 9 children. One of them jumped out the window of wherever they were staying and managed to get to the neighbor's house manacled, and told the neighbor that he was hungry and thirsty, and please, could you help me? And the neighbor called the police, who called Child Protective Services, and the mother, who was giving advice to the nation, was arrested for child abuse because This is the way she treated all of her children, and it was incredibly abusive. I mean, there have been other stories. I know there was one from, this was a Utah mother, but there was one from California not too long ago where a couple had 13 children, and they kept them chained to their beds, and they told the state they were homeschooling them, but they were simply abusing them. It was just a horrible story. I think the parents are both in prison now, and I guess the kids have been farmed out to foster homes. But I think it's very concerning when children have no protection, which is what happens in homeschooling. And I've noted on my blog that whenever I criticize homeschooling, I get a barrage of letters saying, how dare you, we're far more educated than you are, and so forth. But I suspect that quite a lot of homeschoolers have very little education, and they are distrustful of education. They're distrustful of teachers in public schools, and they want their children to know exactly what they know, which is not very much. So they're ill-qualified to teach their children. And it's just another in this kind of spectrum of movements, or part of the same movement, to dumb down America through homeschooling by uneducated parents. Maybe parents should have to take a test before they're allowed to homeschool. That might change the nature of the movement.
Well, it's interesting. Go ahead, Jess.
I was just going to note one other thing contextually about homeschooling and vouchers is what that sometimes flies under the radar is that a number of voucher programs, specifically education savings account types of voucher programs, not all, but some will include homeschooling expenses as a permissible expense to use the voucher funds on. This education savings account vouchers, for those who don't know, could go beyond tuition to a wide range of other expenses for private education. And some of them do include homeschooling. And this feeds into this wide range of expense permissible uses feeds into those accountability problems and the oversight problems that you were alluding to earlier.
And we've also seen in both Arizona and Florida and other states that education savings accounts are being misused. There was a report recently from Florida that permissible expenses include kayaks, trampolines, all sorts of gym equipment, televisions, of course, and also tickets to Disneyland or Disney World. I forget which it is in Florida. But this could never happen in a public school. It wouldn't be permitted.
Yeah, and if Michael, kind of circling back to Michael Ferris, that the article in the Post was very much about, and the legal society that he formed for this. And you can go and take a look at their website. I did not too long ago, and I was appalled. And there are 7 states where you don't even have to report that you're homeschooling your child, even though there's a mandatory education laws in the state. Texas is one of them. It's so nobody really knows. And of course, they applaud all of the laws that have the least accountability. And it's worrisome for me as a mom, as a grandmom, as a former educator, to think about children not knowing whether or not they're really being supervised properly, whether they're being taken care of, whether they're even being educated, and having my tax dollars pay for that. In Arizona, where ESAs started, and sometimes they're called education scholarship accounts, sometimes savings accounts, sometimes freedom accounts. That's the latest iteration of these accounts. You do not have to show that your child learned anything in order to get the money the following year. Nothing. All you have to do is show that you spend the money. And there's been numerous scandals there where people would buy educational items in the local Walmart, then return them for a gift card. So as money through these voucher programs goes out in the system, you're going to have people who may be economically strained, who are not very well educated, as Diane said, or value education, see this as a form of income. This is happening again with micro schools, where someone can just set up shop in their home and take in 5 or 6 kids to educate them without anybody really doing background checks on the teacher or on the other people that are living in the household. So all of these things, I think, should be of deep concern to all of us who who care about children. So I'm wondering if there's any last words that that any of you would like to say or comment upon before we say goodbye. Diane?
First of all, thank Cindy Salazar for giving the names of the homeschoolers who were arrested in both Utah and California. Their names slipped me, but thank you so much for that. And I also want to mention that the State Commissioner of Education in New Hampshire is a homeschooling father who's homeschooled his 10 children. So he has absolutely no regard whatever for public education. And the people of New Hampshire are struggling to keep their schools funded. I think, to me, the long range question is really, where are we going as a nation? And will we have an educated population, or will we deepen the divisions racially, religiously, and by ethnicity and socially and by income? And the path we're on now will deepen those divisions. They're guaranteed to. That's the nature of choice. Choice heightens segregation of all kind. So I see what's looming is more segregation, more divisiveness, less education, and worse education for the kids who need help the most. And it's so obvious to me that I don't understand why it's not obvious to the editorial writers at the Washington Post and the New York Times and every other major newspaper in America, because they should be on a crusade to defend and improve public education.
Jess, closing words?
Well, it's been a great conversation. I would want to just invite anyone in the audience who wants to talk to us more about these things to be in touch, and just to thank Nick and his colleagues for their committed reporting, to thank Network for Public Education for your amazing work, and for partnering with Education Law Center on this webinar and other things, and the audience for the work that we know that you all are doing, and just for your care and commitment to watching these programs and working on these issues. So thank you so much.
Nick?
Yeah, well, I'd just like to thank all of you, Jessica, Diane, Carol, for having this conversation. Your organizations just do such fantastic work. So it's really great to have this conversation and learn from you about the impact and importance of what we learned. So thank you. The other thing I would say is, you know, I just want to stress, Alliance Defending Freedom may not be successful with this effort. You know, hopefully they won't be, because what they're talking about is dismantling the public education system. It staggers me that anybody could actually be for that. But, you know, they say very clearly in these recordings that they're going to keep at this. And they have shown both around issues to do with reproductive health, and attacking gay marriage, which we thought was settled law, and they keep coming at it, that they're persistent. And so I think we just need kind of eternal vigilance on this. And now that we know that they're working on this, to keep watching.
Okay, and before we close, I'd just like to remind you all again that you can meet Diane, Jessica, Nick, and so many other people who are fighting the good fight to stand up for public education and share different strategies that they have, as well as the concerns we all share, at our 10th anniversary conference in Washington, D.C. Please take a look, see if you can register. If you need a little bit of support to get there, get in touch with me. We'll see what we can do. We all need to stand together and push back on this, because as I say, sometimes I feel like we're in this Humpty Dumpty moment. And just like Chile found as a nation, once you start to dismantle your public education system, it becomes incredibly difficult to put it back together again. Good evening, everyone, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol.